Ozzy Osbourne, who just died, bless
Yeah.
him, in his whatever that state that he was in his whole life. We'll never know. We didn't, although he was all over the TV for hundreds of years with his idiocy and nonsense.
Few weeks after the world said goodbye to Ozzy Osbourne, fans were heartbroken again. This time not by grief, but by the biting words of another rock legend. Roger Waters, the outspoken force behind Pink Floyd, chose to speak on Ozzy's legacy in a way that many felt was cruel and dismissive. Instead of honoring a man who shaped heavy metal and left behind decades of influence, Waters chose the wrong words and timing to let out his emotions. His words weren't just unexpected, they were heartbreaking, because it stirred up outrage among those who loved Ozzy the most. What exactly did he say, and why did he choose to speak at the grieving moment? Join us as we explore what Waters said about Ozzy and the world's reaction to his words. Roger Waters' dreadful remark. Just weeks after Ozzy Osbourne's final emotional performance in Birmingham, where he shared the stage with his legendary Black Sabbath bandmates, the music world was hit with devastating news that Ozzy had passed away. Fans were left reeling, struggling to accept life without a man who had defined and shaped heavy metal for over 5 decades. His presence had been so constant that even now, many still find it difficult to believe he is truly gone. At the very moment admirers were reflecting on his immense contributions, Roger Waters of Pink Floyd stepped into the spotlight with remarks that the fans' heart. Waters, known for his outspoken and often provocative nature, was asked in an interview about Ozzy's legacy. Rather than offering a tribute or respectful acknowledgement, he delivered a sharp dismissal that many considered cruelly timed. His words did not come across as mild disagreement or a simple difference in musical taste. They came across as an outright rejection of Ozzy's entire life, career, and influence. What made his comments feel even harsher was the timing and the circumstances surrounding them. Ozzy's impact on music cannot be overstated. As co-founder of Black Sabbath, he was part of a group often credited with inventing heavy metal itself, the band that laid the foundation for an entire genre. Beyond the band, his solo career was equally massive, with over 100 million albums sold worldwide. Ozzy's influence was so great that he was honored twice in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, first with Black Sabbath and later on his own, something that only the most legendary musicians ever achieve. His final show was even a proof of this legacy, with music icons from across the spectrum paying their respects on stage. But when asked to reflect on Ozzy, Waters chose to characterize his public life as little more than foolish antics, brushing off his music and mocking the public image associated with Ozzy's wilder moments. He extended the same dismissal to Black Sabbath, reducing the pioneering band to a sideshow act defined only by its shocking stunts rather than its groundbreaking sound. For many, this was not just a critique of musical taste, it was a belittling of an entire cultural movement that Ozzy helped to create and sustain. The reaction was immediate. Fans of Osbourne, still mourning his passing, were outraged at the perceived lack of respect. To many, Waters' statements felt cold, unnecessary, and timed in the worst possible way. While Pink Floyd's followers might view his bluntness as characteristic of his personality, Ozzy's supporters saw it as an attack on a man whose influence was undeniable. The comments struck a nerve because they ignored decades of achievement, industry recognition, and the genuine affection that millions around the world felt for Ozzy. There is also the personal dimension to consider. Ozzy's family, especially Sharon Osbourne and their children, have always been fiercely protective of him. To hear another music legend publicly tear down his legacy so soon after his death adds another layer of pain for them. Aside from his fans' outrageous reaction, Ozzy's family also reacted to his words, and it was not nice as well. Family and the public's quick backlash. Jack Osbourne wasted no time answering back. Within days of the interview that set off the storm, he used his social channels to call out Roger Waters in blunt terms, describing Waters' remarks as pathetic and out of touch, and making it clear he saw them as a personal attack on his father. His posts were angry and raw, and they landed squarely on social platforms where Ozzy's fans were already gathered, turning a private family grievance into a public confrontation. Sharon Osbourne also made her feelings known, joining the chorus of family defenders. On social posts and comments around the coverage, she condemned Waters' tone and choice to speak that way so soon after Ozzy's death, using language that left little doubt about how she viewed his intervention. Her reaction reinforced that this was not simply a fan spat, but a rebuke from those who stood closest to Ozzy. The backlash didn't stop with the Osbournes. Across social media platforms, longtime fans and casual listeners alike flooded threads, videos, and comment sections with indignation. Forums and communities devoted to heavy metal and classic rock lit up, with many users calling Waters' timing and tone disrespectful. On Facebook groups and YouTube, creators quickly uploaded reaction videos dissecting the interview and defending Ozzy's cultural contribution, while dozens of viral clips and posts loudly publicized the family's responses. That widespread online anger pushed coverage beyond fan circles and into mainstream outlets, which ran stories highlighting the clash between two generations of rock royalty. At the same time, some observers framed the exchange as predictable, given Waters' history of blunt, often provocative commentary. A few commentators argued that Waters was speaking from a long-held disdain for certain corners of rock culture, suggesting his remarks were less about Ozzy personally and more about a long-standing opposing point of view. That line of defense did little to calm the outrage, but it did shape how some outlets covered the story, presenting it less as an outright attack and more as another episode in Waters' pattern of inflammatory public statements. The media covered the story in two different ways. Some outlets focused on the Osbourne family's anger and the huge backlash from fans, while others framed it as just another example of Roger Waters being his usual outspoken self. The coverage itself kept fueling the drama. Family reactions and fan outrage made headlines, and those headlines pulled even more people back into the debate online. Beyond the immediate bitter criticism, the episode raised questions about how musicians should comment on peers who have just passed, and what degree of candid criticism is acceptable in mourning's aftermath. For the Osbourne camp and most of Ozzy's followers, Waters' words crossed a line. For a minority, the episode was another reminder that public figures sometimes speak without calculation. But then, to truly understand the possible reason behind Waters' comment, let's understand his background story. The Pink Floyd moment. Long before the rock legend fame, Roger Waters was once a young boy in the 1960s. And at that time, he was still a student who, alongside Nick Mason, had begun to lose interest in studies and instead found himself drifting toward the lure of music. Together, they settled into a small flat at Stanhope Gardens owned by Mike Leonard, a part-time tutor. And it was here that the seeds of something special started to grow. Waters, Mason, and Richard Wright began experimenting with sounds, joining forces with Keith Noble and Clive Metcalf to form their first band. At the start, they gave themselves names like Sigma 6 and even the Megadeths, never realizing how far this playful beginning would eventually take them. Waters at first played rhythm guitar, Mason sat behind the drums, and Wright would use whatever keyboard he could get his hands on. Keith Noble's sister, Sheila, sometimes added vocals, making their little gatherings feel more alive. The group was far from polished and usually performed at small, private parties, even rehearsing in the basement tea room of the Polytechnic. But this was where the friendships and early chemistry began to take shape. By September 1963, Noble and Metcalfe left to pursue their own music project. Their departure opened the door for Syd Barrett and Bob Close to step in. That change marked a turning point, because Waters moved to the bass guitar, a shift that would define his role in the years to come. With the new lineup in place, the group cycled through a dizzying list of names like the Abdobs, the Screaming Abdobs, Leonard's Lodgers, Spectrum 5, and eventually the T-Set. Each name reflected a band still trying to figure itself out, searching for an identity that matched their growing ambition. By the mid-1960s, the group began to settle on something more lasting. First, they were known as the Pink Floyd Sound, later the Pink Floyd Blues Band, and finally, simply Pink Floyd. With Syd Barrett as the frontman, guitarist, and main songwriter, the group was ready to step into the world in a big way. Barrett's creativity shone on their debut album, The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, released in 1967. He wrote almost all the songs, with Waters adding just one of his own. Still, it was enough to show that Waters was slowly finding his voice as a songwriter. Unfortunately, the brightness of Barrett's star did not last long. By late 1967, his mental health began to crumble, and his behavior became increasingly erratic. The band found themselves struggling to move forward with him at the center, and by early 1968, the situation reached a breaking point. A meeting with their managers ended with Barrett stepping away, making room for David Gilmour to come in. It was a painful but necessary decision, one that changed the path of Pink Floyd forever. The years that followed saw Waters rising into a central creative force. His intensity, vision, and lyrical style shaped much of the band's direction, especially as they began experimenting with concept albums that pushed boundaries. But that same determination often created friction. By the time they were working on their later projects, tension with Gilmour had grown noticeably. Mason later recalled that after disagreements during one particular album, Gilmour's contributions were minimized in the credits, though he still received payment. Reviewers at the time praised the record as a masterpiece of art rock, though many observed it carried the strong imprint of Waters' personal vision. The cracks in the group became harder to ignore. By the mid-1980s, Waters decided he had had enough. In 1985, he officially walked away from Pink Floyd, declaring them creatively finished and beginning a long legal fight over the band's name and legacy. He invoked a clause in his contract to try and dissolve the partnership and prevent the others from using the Pink Floyd name. For Waters, the idea of the band continuing without him felt wrong, almost sacrilegious, like someone trying to carry on the Beatles without John Lennon. Gilmour and Mason, however, had no intention of giving up. They pushed forward, determined to keep the band alive. The legal battle was bitter. In court filings, Waters insisted that Pink Floyd was done creatively and that any continuation without him was an insult to what they had built. Gilmour and Mason stood firm, refusing to accept his claim. By December 1987, a settlement was reached. Waters walked away with the rights to certain concepts he had created, including The Wall and the famous inflatable pig from their stage shows. Meanwhile, Gilmour and Mason carried on under the Pink Floyd name, releasing 3 more studio albums: A Momentary Lapse of Reason in 1987, The Division Bell in 1994, and The Endless River in 2024. Even after the legal dust settled, emotions around the split lingered. Waters often looked back on that time as dark and negative. He admitted later that he had been wrong to impose his own feelings about the music onto the rest of the band when they clearly had their own vision. He came to regret the lawsuit, realizing years later that the Pink Floyd name itself carried a value far beyond individual members. By then, however, the damage to relationships had been done, and although there were occasional reunions, the wounds never fully healed. In the years after his departure, Waters's career continued independently, marked by the same intensity and uncompromising spirit that had defined his time in Pink Floyd. But the shadow of the band and the legal fight always followed him. Looking back, he would sometimes reflect on what might have been had he handled things differently, yet his creative drive never allowed him to look too long in the past. The story of Roger Waters within Pink Floyd is one of ambition, creativity, conflict, and eventual separation. From the early days of a handful of students experimenting with music in a cramped flat to the grandeur of stadium tours and chart-topping albums, Waters was at the heart of it all. His departure in 1985 marked the end of an era, not just for him, but for the band as a whole. And yet, through the tension and legal wrangling, one fact remained. The music they created together had already secured its place in history. For Waters, the journey was complicated, filled with regret, defiance, triumph, and bitterness, all tangled together. For the fans, however, the legacy is simpler. Pink Floyd, whether with or without him, left behind a body of work that still resonates across generations, and Waters' handprints are all over it, from the very first moments when a group of students called themselves Sigma 6, to the massive albums that would define an era. However, just like Rogers did to Ozzy's image, he has said a couple of demeaning words about people and his previous bandmates. Keep watching to find out how he did it. Rogers' various controversial remarks and insults. Roger Waters has long cultivated a reputation not just for musical innovation, but also for being brutally honest, sometimes to the point of being harsh. Over decades, there have been many instances where he's publicly criticized former bandmates, other artists, and made remarks that people have found painful or deeply offensive. Some of these are relevant when you look at how he recently dismissed Ozzy Osbourne's life and legacy. First, his relationship with David Gilmour and the late Rick Wright has been a frequent source of tension and public sniping. Waters has repeatedly questioned their creative contributions to Pink Floyd, suggesting that they lacked ideas or inspiration. He's accused them of dragging him down and claimed they were not artists in the same way he saw himself. Waters has been especially critical of their songwriting abilities and whether they added meaningful artistic weight to the albums that made the band famous. In several interviews, Waters has expressed frustration with how he felt the band dynamics sidelined his vision or downplayed his creative leadership. For example, he has stressed that some of the classic Pink Floyd works were very much his own projects, even if officially credited to the band. He has questioned the roles of Gilmour and Wright, suggesting they were more ornamental or supportive, rather than core contributors in certain phases. This kind of public demeaning of bandmates is not new, but what makes it stand out is Waters often frames it in a way that elevates his role, sometimes in absolute terms, not just as part of a team, but as the main engine of Pink Floyd's creative identity. That recurring theme is relevant when comparing to his recent comments about Ozzy, because in both situations he seems to reduce complex legacies into what he sees as folly, dismissive posturing, or showmanship. Beyond the band, Waters has also had controversies involving remarks that cross into offensive territory, especially around anti-Semitism. A recent documentary by the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism has gathered numerous allegations from people who worked with him, claiming that he made derogatory or mocking remarks about Jewish people, Among other things, there are claims he planned to use an inflatable pig at concerts bearing an anti-Semitic slur, that he mocked a Holocaust victim's family member, or that he disparaged Jewish food in derisive terms. Those allegations are serious, and Waters has defended himself over them, saying that his intent was to challenge power, fascism, or injustice, that it's more about theatrical provocation than hatred. But many people argue that even if the intent was political or dramatic, some of the language and suggestions go well beyond acceptable critique. In 2024, the music company BMG decided to cut ties with Waters and dropped plans to re-release Dark Side of the Moon. The decision came after his increasingly divisive comments about Israel, showing that his controversies were no longer just talk. They were starting to damage his reputation, business deals, and standing in the music world. So, when you put these together, you'll realize it's already a pattern for Waters. He has often been willing to say disparaging things about others, whether bandmates whose contributions he believes were downplayed, or public figures whose politics or identities he challenges. The things he says have sometimes involved personal, identity-based attacks that many consider over the line. When you look at Roger Waters' past controversies and compare them to what he said about Ozzy Osbourne, there are both similarities and sharp differences. The similarity lies in the way he speaks, direct, dismissive, and often cutting in a way that feels more like a personal attack than just a critique of someone's work. He has shown a willingness to take complicated legacies and strip them down to something he sees as shallow or meaningless. But with Ozzy, the impact of his words feels much harsher. The timing makes all the difference. These comments came only weeks after Ozzy's death, when fans and family were still grieving and celebrating his achievements. That gave the remarks a cruel edge, because they didn't just question his music. They dismissed his persona, his image, and the bond he shared with generations of fans. In earlier cases, like his clashes with David Gilmour or accusations tied to political controversies, there was at least some context of feuds, ideology, or provocation. With Ozzy, it feels simply like disrespect. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and also click the next video shown on your screen.